Tonight at 10, a new Prime Minister in Downing Street. Liz Truss insists that Britain can weather the economic storm ahead. Welcomed by Conservative Party colleagues, the new Prime Minister said she would set out plans to deal with fuel bills and with the cost of living crisis.
I am confident that together we can ride out the storm. We can rebuild our economy and we can become the modern, brilliant Britain that I know we can be.
Some cabinet posts have already been filled by Liz Truss's allies, Kwasi Kwarteng as Chancellor, Suella Braverman as Home Secretary, James Cleverly as Foreign Secretary and Therese Coffey as Health Secretary. Earlier, Liz Truss had travelled to Balmoral in Aberdeenshire, where she accepted the Queen's invitation to form a government. Boris Johnson had already left Downing Street, his words prompting speculation that he might want to return at some point.
A day of transition and an evening for the new Prime Minister of shaping her government.
Yes, we'll have the latest on the shape of the new cabinet and on the policy challenges ahead. One other story following the fatal shooting of a schoolgirl in Liverpool. For the first time, the mother of Olivia Pratt-Coble makes a public appeal for the killer to come forward.
I'm hoping that they come forward so this doesn't happen to anybody else.
And coming up on the BBC News Channel, a bit Celtic Park.
Good evening. The new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, has moved into Downing Street, having accepted the Queen's invitation to form a government, and tonight she's already making some key cabinet appointments. On arrival at number 10, Liz Truss said her priorities were tackling the economic situation, the energy crisis and the state of the NHS, and she repeated her controversial commitment to cut taxes to try to revive the economy. We'll have more on the ministerial appointments, including Kwasi Kwarteng as Chancellor, in just a moment. Let's start then with our political editor, Chris Mason, who's in Downing Street tonight.
Yes, good evening to you, Hugh. A first evening in power for Liz Truss on a day of personal triumph for her, political change and constitutional ceremony. This evening has been an evening of phone calls with world leaders, punctuated by cabinet appointments. Here is the story of the day. A day of ritual and weather. A cloudburst puncturing the choreography of the new Prime Minister's arrival, her supporters hunkered under umbrellas, the lectern wearing a bin liner. It was even taken back inside. Her motorcade playing for time with a detour, and then a break in the deluge. The damp stage reset. Within moments, a first glimpse of the new era.
Good afternoon. I have just accepted Her Majesty the Queen's kind invitation to form a new government. Let me pay tribute to my predecessor. Boris Johnson delivered Brexit, the COVID vaccine, and stood up to Russian aggression. History will see him as a hugely consequential Prime Minister. I'm honoured to take on this responsibility at a vital time for our country. We will transform Britain into an aspiration nation with high-paying jobs, safe streets, and where everyone everywhere has the opportunities they deserve. I will take action this day and action every day to make it happen.
Action this day, a phrase borrowed from Winston Churchill. Liz Truss then set out her key objectives.
As Prime Minister, I will pursue three early priorities. Firstly, I will get Britain working again. I have a bold plan to grow the economy through tax cuts and reform. I will cut taxes to reward hard work and boost business-led growth and investment.
Next,
I will take action this week to deal with energy bills and to secure our future energy supply. Thirdly, I will make sure that people can get doctor's appointments and the NHS services they need. We will put our health service on a firm footing.
And with a nod to the weather, both economic and meteorological, the Prime Minister sought to describe the country she now leads, how it is, how she wants it to be.
We shouldn't be daunted by the challenges we face. As strong as the storm may be, I know that the British people are stronger. Our country was built by people who get things done. We have huge reserves of talent, of energy and determination. I am confident that together we can ride out the storm, we can rebuild our economy, and we can become the modern, brilliant Britain that I know we can be. I am determined to deliver. Thank you.
On a day of two Prime Ministers, a little over 8 hours earlier, the departure at breakfast time of Boris Johnson. His most loyal ministers and advisers here to cheer him off. What we were about to witness was a premiership terminated prematurely against Mr Johnson's will. His frustration, his anger, buttered with self-deprecation and wit.
Thank you. This is it, folks. Thank you, everybody, for coming out so early this morning. The baton will be handed over in what has unexpectedly turned out to be a relay race. They changed the rules halfway through, but never mind that now.
The rules weren't changed. The simple truth is no Prime Minister's ever been able to stay in office without the confidence of their party, and he lost that. He remains defiant, almost willing his audience to wonder why on earth his party wanted rid of him. So, what of his future?
I am now like one of those booster rockets that has fulfilled its function, and I will now be gently re-entering the atmosphere and splashing down invisibly in some remote and obscure corner of the Pacific. And like Cincinnatus, I am returning to my plough.
It turns out Cincinnatus was a Roman politician who, yes, you guessed it, made a comeback.
It's time for politics to be over, folks. It's time for us all to get behind Liz Truss and her team and her programme and deliver for the people of this country.
Commanding attention is Boris Johnson's greatest skill, and it seems improbable he'll lose that knack now. But this morning's man's time in office had come and was going. Going via a Highland handover at Balmoral.
Hello, Prime Minister.
Hello, Prime Minister, the greeting, perhaps for the very last time. Within minutes, he'd resigned. Enter next the wobbly plane of Liz Truss, flying in to be Prime Minister by royal appointment. An audience with the Queen and the assumption of office. Her Majesty's 15th Prime Minister, the country's 4th in 6 years. Liz Truss, alongside her husband Hugh O'Leary, on the threshold of government. Her challenges in office, both instant and colossal. Chris Mason, BBC News, at Westminster.
Well then, within an hour of the new Prime Minister's arrival in Downing Street, her ministerial lineup was already taking shape. Kwasi Kwarteng, a long-time ally of Liz Truss, the new Chancellor, and then other allies too, James Cleverly, Foreign Secretary, Suella Braverman, who's the new Home Secretary, succeeding Priti Patel, and Therese Coffey, Deputy Prime Minister and Health Secretary. It means that for the first time, not a single white man will be occupying one of the senior cabinet positions. Our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young, has more details.
Have you got a new job, Mr Kwarteng?
The new Chancellor appointed tonight during difficult economic times. Kwasi Kwarteng needs to come up with a plan to help the country through a cost of living crisis. He's one of Liz Truss's closest political allies, an Eton-educated intellectual who backed Brexit.
This is fabulous.
Instinctively a free marketeer, but he's accepted the need for government intervention in the energy sector and he's already made the case for more borrowing and lower taxes.
Hello, I'm Kwasi Kwarteng from London and I'm reading classics.
Friends admire his intelligence.
Trinity Kwarteng.
The John Paul Getty Museum.
It is indeed.
He was a winner on University Challenge, and the Prime Minister will be hoping he can still find the right answers. Therese Coffey can't hide her delight in the official photo marking her elevation to Deputy Prime Minister. She'll also take on the serious challenge of sorting out the NHS. Heading straight to work tonight, she acknowledged the problems.
We've got priorities A, B, C, D, ambulances, backlogs, care, D, doctors and dentists, and we're going to work through that, and we'll make sure that we are delivering for patients.
The new Home Secretary is Suella Braverman. She stood in a leadership contest, attacking what she called woke rubbish, including the approach schools take to trans rights. There was a hint back then of what her priorities will be now.
Well, I want to fix the problem of illegal boats crossing the Channel, stop a Strasbourg court from interfering in our domestic policies.
James Cleverly is a long-standing ally of Boris Johnson from his time as London Mayor. He's a former Army Reserve officer, and this appointment as Foreign Secretary means for the first time there are no white men in the top 4 jobs. The new Business Secretary, who'll be in charge of energy policy, is Jacob Rees-Mogg. He's spoken out about the costs of the drive to reduce carbon emissions and prefers fracking to wind farms. Among those who've been sacked tonight, some experienced faces: Grant Shapps, Dominic Raab, Steve Barclay and George Eustace. After such a divisive leadership contest, all the talk in Tory circles has been about unity. Can Liz Truss bring her unhappy party back together? Well, she certainly hasn't reached out to those who backed Rishi Sunak. Almost all of them have lost their cabinet jobs. Once again, a new team takes charge inside number 10. Liz Truss has decided she wants her friends around her at the top table as she takes on the toughest of roles. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
And more appointments to be reported tonight. They're coming through steadily. Let's talk to Chris Mason, our political editor, who joins us now again from Downing Street. Chris, what can you tell us about the emerging shape of the government?
Well, Hugh, just as we were watching Vicky's report there, Michelle Donnellan left Downing Street, and she confirmed to us that she is the new Culture Secretary. Handful of other appointments to the Cabinet in the last half hour. Chloe Smith will be the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, the Transport Secretary, Kit Malthouse, the Education Secretary for England, Kemi Badenoch, you'll remember that she was a contender for the Conservative leadership back in the parliamentary stages in July. She will be the International Trade Secretary. Let's step back and examine how this cabinet looks at this stage. It does appear pretty much complete now. It has to be, because there's a cabinet meeting taking place first thing tomorrow morning. As Vicky mentioned there has been a purge of the Sunakites. Prominent supporters of Rishi Sunak don't feature around the top table. Now, this is still a work in progress, of course. The lower ranks of the government are still to be filled in, and I would expect there will be some who backed Rishi Sunak who are perhaps appointed at that level. One other point worth making tonight, we were talking on the BBC's Newscast podcast a little earlier this evening to a very close follower of Conservative politics who pointed out that if you look at the new cabinet and you compare it with David Cameron's last cabinet of just 6 years ago, there is only one survivor, and that survivor, one Liz Truss. So yes, there's been a lot of churn at the very top of government, as we've reflected in the last couple of nights with the number of prime ministers in recent years, but also within the cabinet as well.
Can we turn to policy? I think lots of people will be expecting to know when, for example, there will be policy detail around the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis. What can we tell viewers?
It looks like it is still likely to happen on Thursday. I've been told throughout the week that that's when it is penciled in for. I don't think the government has any appetite to let it slip, given there is that clamour for detail, understandably, beyond all of the hullabaloo and so many of the politics here in the last couple of days. And we heard specifically from the Prime Minister today that it would be this week, as opposed to within a week of her taking office. The other thing to mention tonight, the Chancellor in the morning meeting bank chief executives and financial institution heads in the Treasury to set out his plan and the government's approach ahead of a mini budget in a couple of weeks, where the focus there likely to be tax cuts.
Chris, many thanks again. Chris Mason with the latest there on those appointments in Downing Street and indeed on the policy picture. Let's stay with that because, as we know, tackling the cost of living crisis the Prime Minister said, is the first task facing her. In all parts of the UK, there are reports of households and businesses struggling to make ends meet, and that is before next month's energy price rises come into effect. Our social affairs correspondent Michael Buchanan reports from Southend in Essex, where residents of one street say that they are hoping the new Prime Minister can come up with some help.
Money's long been tight in Cluny Square, a close-knit neighbourhood of mainly young families and pensioners in Southend.
It's a fantastic community now. Everybody pulls together. If someone's giving away a washing machine, everyone will know about it.
Wendy Wilson runs the cafe on behalf of a small charity. Rising costs means she's reluctantly had to raise prices.
If I put a cup of tea up 20p, are they going to be able to afford it? And the answer is no. I put it up 10p.
Wendy, who lives with her young son, is struggling personally as well. On Saturday, she had to get rid of her 2 dogs as they were becoming too expensive.
It's the worst thing to do. The worst. They're like my children, and, you know, now the house is so quiet. It's not fair that I've had to do it, but I've got no choice. I've got to look after myself and my son.
Many of the residents are cohabiting or single parents, and the square comes alive in the afternoon when the school day ends.
I've increased the amount of money that I give towards my food bill a month by a quarter.
Kick it, Daddy.
College lecturer Adam Weaver has 3 children, including Riley, who started school this week. Though both Adam and his partner work full-time, they find they're increasingly having to say no to their children.
Would you say you have money worries at the moment?
Daily. Decisions are made daily about where I save money. In terms of quality of life, you know, trips out, day trips, the times we'd go away in the car, all those kind of things have stopped.
I need at least extra £50 a week to get me by.
Dennis Kerner's cupboard full of medicine says everything. The 74-year-old has multiple health conditions. Money worries don't help. His weekly food bill is up 50%. His monthly energy bills have almost tripled.
I switch off as much as I can with electric. I have to have my nebuliser and also my machines. They do burn up it, but I need that to keep alive.
We will put our nation.
We gathered everyone in the cafe to watch the Prime Minister's speech. Both Dennis and Wendy are long-standing Tory voters.
I think that was absolutely insulting. She's had weeks to plan and come out today and actually put people at ease. And what did we get? The same generic statement that we get from every new Prime Minister.
Well, she hasn't really discussed anything that we need to do.
I don't hold much hope in her. I think she should have said a bit more to put us all at ease.
Michael Buchanan, BBC News, Southend in Essex.
Well, as Chris Mason mentioned earlier, we are told to expect a detailed announcement on Thursday about the emergency plan to deal with soaring energy bills for households and for businesses. So let's join our business editor, Simon Jack, who's with me, who has more details about the proposal. Simon?
Thanks, Hugh. Yeah, we're expecting a big plan which has been assembled at high speed. But the government plan is trying to achieve 2 important goals. First, head off the coming October the 1st price rise from the current cap on typical bills from £1,971 to £3,549 by either freezing them here or at least lowering the October price cap to somewhere in between the two, perhaps £2,500 we're hearing. Second, lower energy costs for businesses by capping and lowering the amount suppliers can charge per unit of the energy they use. So how much will doing that cost? Well, it depends on how long the government price controls last and what happens to the real market price. It's estimated the cost of limiting household bill rises and capping business bills could cost around £100 billion. So how will that be paid for? There are 3 options. You could let energy companies borrow billions in government-backed loans to be repaid through customer bills over the next decade or more. But this would lock customers into higher bills for longer. Not ideal. Pay for the intervention through general taxation, higher taxes, not an attractive option for a Prime Minister that has pledged to cut them, which leaves option 3, now looking the most likely. The government just borrows the money and adds it to the UK's overall and growing debt pile. But remember, this is a time when the government's cost of borrowing is at its highest for 8 years. But the government argues a big, bold plan is the only way to stave off recession while at the same time reducing inflation. It's a massive move from a Prime Minister in week 1 and a move that may define her entire time in office. Hugh.
Simon, many thanks for taking us through that. Simon Jack there, our business editor. So, when we're talking about a package on that scale, to deliver that, of course, Liz Truss will have to work closely with the new Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng. Let's talk to our economics editor, Faisal Islam. What can you tell us about the kind of economic approach that they are lining up?
Well, we're hearing a new word being mentioned, which we didn't hear from the previous government about this current situation, and it's the word emergency, and consciously likening it to the situation around COVID in March 2020. And that is what underlines the sorts of figures that Simon has just talked about and the justification for borrowing tens of billions of pounds more, which is what is coming to fund that. But the new Chancellor and the new Prime Minister have some clear ideas on trying to promote economic growth through tax cuts, medium term too. Indeed, that was the first thing she mentioned in terms of her priorities in the speech. And so the question is, will the size of this energy package and the amount of borrowing that it entails, will that sort of prefigure or in some way limit the extent or the timing of the tax cuts that will come in an emergency budget in a couple of weeks? There could be a balancing act, because if you look at the markets, even today, they looked at these tales of tens of billions, 100 billion more in borrowing, and they did start to charge the United Kingdom government effectively extra interest to borrow over 5-10 years. That affects interest rates for mortgages and for businesses, and for the Bank of England too, which makes a decision next week. Increasingly, it's thought that they might raise by faster than expected. So she has plans, the new Chancellor has strategies, but events in terms of what's happening in the world and what's happening in the economy beyond our full control could prefigure all of this.
OK, Faisal, many thanks again. Faisal Islam there, our economics editor. Well, as we heard, the Prime Minister, when she arrived in Downing Street, included the NHS in her list of priorities, a promise of access to the doctor's appointments, the NHS services in England that are sorely needed by many people. The first member of the Cabinet to be announced tonight was Therese Coffey, the new Health Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister. Let's talk to our health editor, Hugh Pym, who's at University College Hospital in central London. And Hugh, just talk us through then the kind of range of issues that they're needing to deal with in pretty short order.
Yes, Hugh, Liz Truss may have set the NHS as one of her top priorities. It's, of course, the NHS in England because health is devolved. But there are a lot of problems for Therese Coffey, the new Health Secretary, to face up to. One of them is ambulance delays and waits. The latest figures show average response times were nearly an hour, even for serious cases like strokes and heart attacks, when the target was just 18 minutes. Then there's an increasing number of patients waiting for operations, hip replacements, knee replacements and so on, with 6.73 million on the waiting list for planned operations and procedures. Now, Liz Truss mentioned doctors' appointments. She's previously stressed the importance of GP services, but the numbers show that the number of fully qualified GPs in England stands at about 27,500. That's down nearly 250 on a year earlier, even though the workload is increasing. So patient dissatisfaction is certainly rising. And of course, there was no mention of social care. Health chiefs say only investment there will really, in the short term, take the pressure off the NHS.
Hugh, many thanks. Hugh Pym, our health editor there at University College Hospital. In Scotland, the First Minister said that she would attempt to build a good working relationship with Liz Truss, despite their clear political differences. This afternoon, the First Minister set out her government's plans for the year ahead. Let's join our Scotland editor, James Cook. What is the prospect of a decent working relationship between these two leaders, James?
It's a really good question, and I think the short answer is we're going to have to wait and see. Nicola Sturgeon congratulated Liz Truss, and really it's been a day here, Hugh, of discussing what she can do and what she can't do. Let's start with what she can't do. She can't, Nicola Sturgeon, act on energy bills, and she urged the incoming Prime Minister to do so to tackle what she called a humanitarian crisis. She can't protect the budget here from the ravages of inflation either, and she warned that there may be cuts to existing programmes, some of which could be be set out tomorrow. What can she do, though? Well, she is increasing a welfare payment to children in low-income families. She's freezing rail fares until March on the nationalised ScotRail, and she is banning evictions and freezing rents, not just in social housing but in private housing too, described by landlords as a political attack which will cut the supply of housing and lead to more hardship, but described by the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, this evening as a bold action he'd like to replicate. There's also the matter of an independence referendum bill. Whether she can or can't do that might be up to the Supreme Court.
Indeed, James, many thanks. A long list there. James Cook, our Scotland editor, with the latest in Edinburgh. Well, this evening, Ukraine's President Zelensky said that he was the first foreign leader to talk to Liz Truss. And we know that she has, of course, spoken to President Biden as well this evening. So how has the rest of the world responded then to the appointment as Britain's new Prime Minister? In a moment, we'll hear from Steve Rosenberg, our Russia editor. But first, we're going to cross to Washington and our North America correspondent, John Sudworth, to tell us more. John?
Well, Hugh, cynics would say that the special relationship amounts to little more nowadays than the obligatory phone call that follows shortly after the appointment of a new British Prime Minister. But the statement from Downing Street suggests that this was a conversation just as much about substance as symbolism. The two leaders agreeing that the special relationship was based on shared values and promising to work together to build global freedom and ensure that Vladimir Putin fails in Ukraine. But in a way, that's the easy stuff. There is plenty of scope for friction and tension as well. The statement went on to say that they spoke of the need to preserve the Good Friday Agreement. In British terms, that's a pretty positive spin on an area of deep concern for Washington. Joe Biden, of course, very proud of his Irish roots. He has spoken before of how he is concerned about the potential of undermining the peace process. And it'll be interesting to look when we get the readout from the White House here of that conversation, how much the language compares and contrasts with that out of Downing Street.
Well, one thing's for sure, in the building behind me, they will not have been breaking out the champagne over Liz Truss becoming Prime Minister. The Russian leadership does not like Liz Truss. It doesn't like her strong public support for Ukraine. It doesn't like her strong public criticism of the Kremlin, the fact that she's called for Vladimir Putin's defeat in Ukraine. So what has the Kremlin been saying? Well, President Putin's spokesman has said that with Liz Truss in Downing Street, the best Russia can hope for is that relations with the UK don't get even worse than they are now. Now, meanwhile, the Russian government newspaper has been saying all kinds of things about Liz Truss today. It called her the pseudo-Iron Lady, the Margaret Thatcher mimic, and Poor Lisa was another nickname that's based on the name and the major character of a famous Russian short story, a love story that has a tragic ending. You can see there's little optimism in Moscow tonight.
Steve, many thanks. Steve Rosenberg there in Moscow and John Sudworth for us in Washington. More updates for you, more news and analysis on BBC News Online. All the developments today at Westminster and the new government taking shape, bbc.co.uk/news. And then, of course, you also have the BBC News app available to you. Stay with Ukraine there, because the UN's nuclear watchdog has called for a security zone to be set up around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in southern Ukraine. Last week, a team from the International Atomic Energy Agency visited the site, which was seized by Russian troops back in March. Their report described the current situation as untenable and said urgent measures were needed to prevent a nuclear accident. For the first time since the death of her daughter, the mother of Olivia Pratt-Corbell, who was killed by a gunman trying to enter their house in Liverpool last month, has called for him to own up. In the video, which was filmed and released by Merseyside Police, Cheryl Corbell, who was injured in the shooting, paid tribute to Olivia, saying that she was an amazing girl and loved life. Our North of England correspondent Judith Moritz has more details.
I'm on it as well.
Grabbing onto her dad for comfort, Olivia Pratt-Corbell was spellbound by the Christmas fair, eyes wide and full of questions.
What's that big black thing? Forklift.
Today, both of her parents have told of the depths of their loss. Her father, John, said the little girl was his bright spark. And still nursing her own injury from the gun attack which killed her daughter,
Olivia's mum Cheryl spoke in a video released by Merseyside Police.
She left a mark on everyone that she met. And she may well have only been 9, but she packed a lot in them 9 years.
Cheryl Corbell appealed directly to the gunman who burst into her home 2 weeks ago and to anyone who may be helping him.
You know you've done wrong, so you need to own up. Like I've taught my kids. You do something wrong, you own up to it. If anyone is hiding these guns, they need to speak up, because they need to be off these streets. No one at all should have to go through this.
4 men have been arrested. 1 is suspected of Olivia's murder, and 3 are being held on suspicion of assisting an offender. Judith Moritz, BBC News.
First time there that Olivia's mum has been speaking publicly and making that appeal. That was Judith Moritz reporting. Now let's catch up with the women's football, and Wales have made it through to the World Cup playoffs tonight. Meanwhile, the England team are back in action for the first time on home soil since their victory in the Euros. They face Luxembourg at Stoke City. Our sports correspondent Jo Curry is there. Let's join her.
Well, after a glorious summer of women's football, the celebrations continued this evening. Wales women, who have never qualified for a major tournament, took a huge step towards next summer's World Cup by gaining a playoff berth. As for the Lionesses, well, here in Stoke, over 24,000 fans turned out to welcome them and the European trophy home, and they were rewarded with a big win against Luxembourg.
A sellout crowd at Stoke on a Tuesday night can only mean the European champions are in town. A first glimpse for these fans to see their new idols on home soil after their summer heroics. With World Cup qualification already sealed and playing a team ranked 113th in the world, this was always going to be a procession. And after Alessia Russo was brought down in the box, it was left to Georgia Stanway to open their account and set the tone as they found themselves 5-0 up by half-time. And they didn't hold back in the second half. Nikita Paris amongst the goals as England eased to a comfortable win to the delight of their fans.
And she enjoyed that one, Nikita Paris.
Wales' game against Slovenia had been described as the biggest in their history, with a draw being enough to secure a playoff berth. Slovenia threatened in the first half to set the Welsh nerves jangling. They themselves challenged after the break, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't find a way past the Slovenian keeper. But in the end, the lack of goals didn't matter. 0-0 enough to see them through.
Yes, tonight very much belonging to Wales. England eventually turned out 10-0 winners. There are also victories for Northern Ireland and Scotland. Meanwhile, the Men's Champions League group stages also got underway this evening, watched by Andrew Swiss.
Become the second half, Real's class finally told.
Here's Vinicius Junior.
That put them ahead, and further goals from Luka. Manchester City, meanwhile, were away to Sevilla, where their new goal-scoring machine was at it again. Erling Haaland scoring his 11th and 12th of the season, and it's barely September, remember, as City ultimately cruised to a 4-0 victory. It's a shock 1-0 win, early days, but for Chelsea, early worries. Andy Swiss, BBC News.
Well, here the England players will now return to their clubs at the start of the women's domestic season, which gets underway this weekend. The next time they pull on their national team jerseys will be against the world champions USA at Wembley next month. Hugh.
Jo, many thanks again. Jo Curry there for us with the latest on tonight's football. It is 10:34. Louise is here with the weather. I don't want to talk about the rain today, Louise, because I'm still drying out.
Yes, interesting, wasn't it? A very interesting day today. The irony, really, after that record-breaking heat of the summer and the drought. If you did miss it, this was what happened at Downing Street just around half an hour before Liz Truss came out to take her first speech as Prime Minister. So you were very lucky indeed. Anybody standing there with an umbrella, you were able to put it away because the sunshine came out, albeit very briefly. Just take a look. Half an hour later, the thunderstorms arrived and we've seen some intense rain. yet again across the southeast and actually into East Anglia, where we are desperate for some much needed rainfall. The showers, the thunderstorms have eased for the time being, and I think it will be a slightly quieter night in comparison to nights just past. So some of those showers easing away, but just watch the track of this thundery plume that's heading up along the North Sea, and it's going to push back into eastern Scotland. That could trigger some really intense thundery downpours towards dawn tomorrow morning. Elsewhere, we'll see a little bit of patchy mist and fog, and temperatures still holding up, still relatively mild. So still the risk of some thundery downpours across parts of Aberdeenshire and lingering in the far north of Scotland first thing in the morning. Elsewhere, we'll start off with some sunshine, but also some showers. The low pressure is still with us, sitting there, driving in gusty winds, 30-40 miles an hour across the southwest. That's where the sharpest of the showers will be. Further east, we will keep some sunshine and perhaps some warmth, but it will be a little bit fresher tomorrow in comparison to the last couple of days, and certainly not as humid. Now, the low pressure will start to drift its way steadily eastwards, and into the weekend, we'll start to see this ridge of high pressure building, quietening things down. So some showers, some thunderstorms to develop, but then hopefully into the weekend, a little bit fresher, a little bit drier. Hugh.
We look forward to it, Louise. Thanks very much. Louise Lear there with the weather. That's all from BBC News at 10. News continues on BBC One. Newsnight is getting underway on BBC Two. But before we join our colleagues across the nations and regions for the news where you are, we will leave you with some key moments from the day's events in Downing Street and beyond. So have a good night.
I'm now like one of those booster rockets that has fulfilled its function, and I will now be gently re-entering the atmosphere and splashing down invisibly in some remote and obscure corner of the Pacific.
I am confident that together we can ride out the storm, we can rebuild our economy, and we can become the modern, brilliant Britain that I know we can be. I am determined to deliver. Thank you.